I was 11 when my uncle was first admitted to a psychiatric hospital. His name is Alec, and he's the reason that I'm here today talking about Hellblade, Senua's Sacrifice. He was arrested during a psychotic episode during which he began knocking down the walls in his apartment trying to find the voices who had been talking to him. After a short stay in jail, he was evaluated by a psychiatrist, diagnosed with schizophrenia and transferred to a psychiatric hospital. It devastated my family. Now, when I say his name is Alec and he's the reason that I'm here today talking about this game, I also mean that he is literally the reason that I'm here today. He is the reason that my parents met, and hence, he is the reason that I'm alive. He is the middle child of 3 siblings, my mum being the oldest and my other uncle the youngest. He served with my dad during their time in the army, and my parents first met at his 21st birthday party. Growing up, he showed slight signs of antisocial personality disorder, flying into occasional fits of rage as a child, but nothing that couldn't be dismissed as a boy growing up and gradually learning that he wasn't always going to get his own way. He lived a fairly normal life as a teen and an adult, as normal as it gets for a soldier anyway. Although, one night he was almost killed by his bunkmate who accidentally discharged his rifle upwards through my uncle's bunk, narrowly missing him while he slept. I often wonder how he processed the thought of being that close to death. It certainly seems like a situation that would make you reevaluate your life. We would visit him at the psychiatric hospital, and although he never talked about his psychosis, the other symptoms of schizophrenia were right there with him, and they would stay with him for the rest of his life. A blunt affect showing flat expressions and little emotion, alogia, which is basically a deprivation of speech, anhedonia, an inability to feel pleasure, asociality, the lack of desire to form relationships, and avolition, a lack of motivation and apathy. Schizophrenia is a complicated condition involving the dopamine reward response system, and often these kinds of symptoms can reduce the expected outcome and quality of life for someone living with the condition. I am frequently compared to my uncle by my family. We both look similar and have similar temperaments. My gran is getting older now, and she often calls me Alec by mistake, and she will often continue to do so without realising it, even when she is corrected. Although the DSM-5 acknowledges that most people with schizophrenia have no family history of psychosis, there is a genetic factor to the condition. The highest risk is associated with having first-degree relatives who have had psychotic episodes. Growing up with all this, part of me had always assumed that I too would end up with the condition. As a teenager growing up, I always felt that I wasn't normal. I struggled to understand complex social interactions. I was often full of doubt and pessimism. I preferred being alone and would often get consumed by my hobbies to an unhealthy amount. I still do. I would often wonder about how my family described my uncle's schizophrenia and psychosis. This idea of hearing voices that weren't really there. I would look it up in the dictionary, I would read books about it in the library, and I started to wonder if I was hearing voices. I mean, I talked to myself often in my head, with some thoughts helping and encouraging me, and some thoughts condemning me, telling me, what's the point in even trying to make something of myself? And at a few low points, telling me, well, that things would be easier if I just wasn't here anymore. As far as I understand though, this is just my inner monologue, and it's a relatively normal thing that we all experience. But I wasn't so sure. Even if I had never experienced any of the psychosis involved with schizophrenia, I had certainly experienced some of the other symptoms at various points of my life. Asociality in particular. In my quest to find out more about myself and my behaviour, I studied psychology and ended up getting a degree in it thanks to the encouragement of my family. And now things in my life make a bit more sense to me. I know I'm certainly atypical, but I'm okay with that. Hopefully you can understand then why I was so intrigued with this game when it came out. A game that would show people what living with psychosis was really like. A game where someone with psychosis would be the hero and not painted as an out-of-control rampaging villain. A game that would give me a glimpse into what my uncle went through. And a game set in my own country, featuring my own people, the Picts, the indigenous people of northeast Scotland, who have the sole distinction of holding off the invading armies of Rome, mostly through a new type of guerrilla warfare that was new to the Romans, and the fact that we held no conquerable cities or had centralised farmland for the Romans to burn and exploit. We were a society that was adept at living off the land. We could easily uproot and move from one area to another, and, crucially, we refused to meet the Romans in open battle as others had done. Basically, we held out long enough to make the Romans give up in frustration, although we do tend to paint the story with a little bit more glory and honour than that. Technically, the Picts are only half of my ancestry. The other side of my family is half English and half South Asian, so I'm one of those mixed race people that presents a problem for the collectivist viewpoint. I'm technically an oppressor and the oppressed at the same time. I'm both the colonizer and the colonized. I think I owe myself reparations at this point, but I'm not exactly sure how all this works. I think it depends on whether I choose to identify as an oppressor or the oppressed, or perhaps some other non-binary group in the middle. I don't know. It's difficult to follow the way identity works in the current year, but I'm digressing. After seeing Hellblade get so many great reviews, I bought it instantly, and it sat in my library. It sat in my library for a long time. It sat in my library for 5 years. I would log into Steam and see Senua staring upwards, staring up at the obstacles that lay in front of her, staring up at the obstacles that lay inside of her, staring up at the voices talking to her. Yeah, I could play Hellblade, but I could also farm some rift crystals from my friends in Dragon's Dogma. Oh, and I need to tank for my guild in Elder Scrolls Online, and of course there's always another settlement that needs my help. There was just always something else that needed to be done. That's what I told myself. I just needed some more spare time to play Hellblade. A time when I could play undisturbed. A time when I had a break from work. I mean, come on, the game is 8 hours long, for goodness sake. In short, I told myself that I would play it later. And so later became even later. 1 month became 1 year. It was imperceptible at first. After all, there's nothing unusual about buying a game and having it sit in your library for a while, especially when you buy several in the Christmas Steam sale and then get back to work in January and forget about them. We all know that eventually you can be overwhelmed by the choice of which game to play. Especially today when modern gaming means you're probably going to be playing a buggy, broken mess of a game that shoves the cash shop, battle passes, and live services down your throat, expecting you to be grateful for getting anything at all, and claiming that the game is in fact a brave, heroic masterpiece for bothering to include a non-white character. But yeah, that's a whole other video. As far as I knew, Hellblade suffered from none of these problems, and yet still, Senua sat in my library like a wolf, waiting in the dark, baring its teeth with every glance in her direction. And 1 year became 5 years. Why wasn't I playing it? This game was a diamond in the rough. It was a game that had successfully walked both sides of the culture war. It featured a female character that didn't spawn numerous forum posts about diversity quotas, Gamergate, and Anita Sarkeesian. It was something that didn't pander to the 30-something white male gamer stereotype, nor pander to his snarky, blue-haired counterpart loudly denouncing the patriarchy. A game with a female protagonist whose Steam artwork tab did not contain ridiculous body shape modding, simping, gooning, or any thirst-fueled cosplay of any type. No, in fact, this artwork tab contains something else. Something real. Senua and her suffering, mental illness, pain, loss, isolation, memories, family, failure, pain, loss, mental illness and suffering. Oh yeah, that's why I wasn't playing it. It had something to say about my life. And those were things that maybe I didn't want to hear. What would it make me think about my uncle and his struggles? What would it make me think about how I and my family had treated him? Would it perhaps even trigger psychosis in myself? What would happen if this game confirmed that I, too, was already suffering from schizophrenia, as I had thought in the past? These were things that I struggled to face, and so it would have gone on like this. 5 years would have become 10. 10 years would have become never. And so on, in a never-ending cycle of running from the truth. That's what would have happened, if not for one video. This video by Sid, also known as Leonardo da Sinci, I'll link it in the description. It popped up recently on my homepage and, no offense to Sid, but I wasn't expecting much. When you spend a lot of time immersed in a hobby or any art form, you begin to notice that most things produced in it are just, well, kind of okay. A few things are unbelievably brilliant. And a few things are monstrously, hideously terrible. But most things are just, okay. After reading the comments on his video, I quickly realised that this one was different. It was made by someone suffering from psychosis, but who still wanted to experience the game and talk about their experience with it. Throughout it, he gives a harrowing account of what it's like to live with the condition, both within the struggles of his own mind and also the outward social struggles of what other people might think of him if they were to find out he had this condition. It shows the importance of supporting people who suffer from mental illness. He mentions that he only made it through the game with the help of a few friends in voice chat who gave him a trusted voice to listen to, a rock with which he could anchor his experience around. His video is well worth a watch to say the least. Now, I did not know how good Sid's video was at the time, but I was certainly curious enough to hear what he had to say about it. And if Sid was brave enough to play and talk about this game, then I could do the same. I saved his video, I installed the game, and I faced what it had to say. Senua's introductory boat ride is understated and magnificent. The sound of her oar splitting the water. The narrator bringing us up to speed on Senua's quest. The voices in her head, her furies, giving their interpretation of events. And of course, Senua's defiant reaction to them as we realise that she can hear them too. Kicking away the log, committing her on this journey. As if burning the boats behind her, making it clear that she has no intention of returning home. Victory or death. Senua refuses to look directly into the camera, as if we, the player, are just another voice in her head that she refuses to engage with. We are introduced to the lore of this world, and a lot of exposition provided by the narrator. The Northmen invaded her homeland in the Orkney Isles, in the way that people of the Norse culture did during the Middle Ages. The Norse people eventually colonised not just Orkney, but also the Shetland Isles, the Hebrides, the islands of Firth and Clyde, and a large part of North Scotland for several centuries. Again, if we were to apply the collectivist lens, then we probably need to ask the Norwegians, when can we expect to receive those reparations, lads? We're introduced to rune doors, the game's main method of gating progress. These rune doors lock us into one area, and force us to explore and solve puzzles to find the corresponding rune in the environment to open the door. And then of course, the most fun part of the game for me, the combat. It's exhilarating, brutal, raw, it's up close and personal. There's a real weight behind each swing and attack. The parry animation reminds me of Aragorn's scene in Fellowship of the Ring, where he parries Lurt's dagger out of the air. Senua is capable of a directional sidestep and roll dodge assigned to tap and double tap respectively. She can use quick light attacks, slow, powerful heavy attacks, a teep front kick to break her opponent's guard and throw them off balance. She can block, and this is tied to a parry mechanic which she can use to leave opponents stunned and open to a counterattack. As someone who sunk hundreds of hours into Dark Souls 1, I felt quite at home here after plugging in my controller. I spent my time slowly watching, studying movesets and waiting for attacks, practicing my parry timing and counterattacks with a few quick hits. It took me some time before I realised how important combos were at taking down the enemies with larger health pools. Simply waiting to parry and riposte with a few light attacks of my own took a very long time to wear those types of enemies down. This focus on combos is only to be expected from a developer involved in making DMC, the Devil May Cry reboot. I also realised later that I could use sprinting attacks to close distance quickly and maximise damage to stunned enemies. Camera is immediately locked onto an enemy as soon as it appears, and this lock-on can be shifted to each enemy in turn in a very Souls-like fashion, but it cannot be fully unlocked during combat, not until all enemies are cleared. With some enemies trying to outflank you and many spawning in behind you, this permanently locked-on mechanic makes it difficult to see what is going on around you, especially with the camera locked in so tight behind. Some reviewers have praised this, saying it adds to the claustrophobic, stressful feel of combat, and I can see where they're coming from. When an enemy attacks Senua from behind, her Furies warn her about it, which prompts the player to dodge and avoid damage from the attack. This is a neat way of weaving Senua's psychosis into the gameplay. It is also the only time in the game where her voices are uniformly and unambiguously telling her the truth. Her voices tend to enjoy causing Senua distress, and they take pleasure when she harms herself on several occasions. But when her life is in danger, they will guide her and warn her of things that she wouldn't otherwise know about. I suppose they realise that their existence is tied up with Senua's. If she dies, then they cease to be, but more on that later. Thematically, it's a nice idea. It's implied later that Senua's psychosis gives her an edge in battle as a warrior, hinting that it's akin to having a sixth sense. It's somewhat of an interesting mechanic for the developers to choose, given that people suffering from psychosis aren't recommended to follow the advice of any voice they hear, because that advice is often not in their best interest. Clearing the first enemies reveals 3 paths for Senua, the ultimate path being the doorway that leads to the Bridge of Helheim, the bridge which Senua must cross in order to reach Hela and bargain for her lover's soul. This door, however, is locked and can only be opened by defeating 2 guardians, Surt, a fire giant from the Norse world of Muspel and keeper of the right-hand path, Valravn, the god of illusion and boss of the left-hand path. Along the left path we face puzzles based on illusions and pattern matching. Again, a thematically interesting mechanic given the need that some sufferers of psychosis have to see meaning and patterns in otherwise unrelated things. Along the second path, we relive the Northmen's attack on Senua's village, during which her partner lost his life. The gameplay in most of these sections is, well, I would describe it as slow. Half walking simulator, half point and click adventure game as you explore every corner of the map for that exact place to line up the illusions and match patterns. It was very satisfying to complete each puzzle, if a little frustrating at times, searching out the precise area within which to stand. Senua experiences flashbacks in the form of these fire visions along the second path. Once they are activated, you are forced to run in a particular direction to avoid the fire. With a time limit to find the correct path through the fire, there is a lot of trial and error involved. Taking the wrong turn or taking too much time to assess the situation results in a player death and the restart of the checkpoint. It slightly spoils the delight of slowly exploring these small areas. With no assistance from quest markers, a compass or a heads-up display, Senua must slowly make her way through the area, mapping it out in her head. And it feels a little disjointed to all of a sudden be railroaded into certain directions. Precise, brutal nature of the timing-based combat matched against the slow walking simulator type puzzles is a stark contrast. Between my work schedule and the time it took to write up my experiences with this game, I only managed to play it split up over the course of 4 days. Whenever I started the game or completed a long puzzle section, all of a sudden I would be thrust into the combat, and it would take me a few minutes to remember the controls, the combos, and to get a feel for the different parry timings. Just when I started to feel like I was mastering it, the battle would finish, and I would then be forced into another slow-paced puzzle. The battles take place in these small circular areas that you are locked into, with no option of retreat. It's not like a Souls game where you can fall back and lose aggro with the enemies. You have no choice but to beat these monsters in order to move forward. It's a very claustrophobic, anxiety-inducing template, which I think is what the developers were aiming at. However, I imagine that those players who are wanting more of a slower puzzle-based walking game will be put off by the forced combat section. They were my favourite part of the game, yet even I found it frustrating that it took me so long to adapt to each encounter. I kept wishing for a practice option in the main menu, some way I could set up waves of enemies or bosses to practice against and perfect my timings. And that's a strange thing for me to say because I normally don't enjoy that type of endless wave mode, but the combat in this game was so satisfying that it just left me wanting more. I later found after beating the game that you can replay the last chapter, which does feature an endless mode. I did that a few times to get more video footage and improve at the game, but I would have loved to have had access to a mode like that from the beginning. We can look at this situation from a narrative point of view. Senua passed her warrior trials, and it's implied in the game that her furies give her a natural advantage over the others in her village. So it would be nice to enter each combat encounter with even just 15 minutes of practice behind me, feeling like a seasoned professional warrior. On the other hand, again from a narrative perspective, maybe the developers wished for Senua to appear out of her depth, panicking against these hideous monstrosities, and so they wished the player to feel that too. I'm honestly not sure. It's also possible that other players didn't have the same problem I did, and so maybe I'm just getting old, forgetful, and losing my reflexes. So for those players looking for a relaxed game who might be put off by the combat, I imagine that there's also a set of players looking for an exciting combat-based game who were put off by the slower puzzle sections. This game seems to walk a strange line between walking simulator and action game. Part of me thinks that maybe the developers ought to have picked one side or the other, or perhaps integrated the two parts in a different way, but hey, the game won multiple awards throughout 2017, 2018 and 2019, including Best Action and Adventure Game at the Independent Game Developers Association 2017, so what do I know? They definitely seem to have done something right and struck a chord with many players, and it seems like a huge part of that was due to Senua's writing and her story. From the moment Senua is introduced, we see that she is a complex character. She has sailed to the shores of the Norse underworld, to the gates of Helheim in order to save her lover. She is haunted by doubting, laughing voices that she shuns, ignores, and carries on regardless. She is scared, alone, and afraid, but nonetheless she continues on. She is far from the girl boss trope, delivering snarky one-liners that we see so much of in today's writing. And there's also no ham-fisted setup involving the hasty framing of a sympathetic character. What we see of Senua is that she is flawed. She is approaching her breaking point, but somehow, still, just about managing to hold things together. It's a very relatable approach to character writing. Most of us aren't superheroes capable of saving the day, and then giving an empowering look or witty one-liner at the right moment. The feeling of barely holding things together at your breaking point is something that we all know too well. Sadly, some people can encounter this feeling from a young age. I'm not sure I can manage one more day. I'm not sure I can manage one more step. It seems today that in an attempt to be empowering and inspiring, characters are written with almost no flaws. Or they're flaws that they are too good or too perfect, and it's only society that's holding them back. For those of us who are deeply flawed and broken people, it's a genuinely shocking moment to see someone on screen who actually represents what that is like. To see someone on screen with problems that cannot be fixed through empowering girl boss messaging. From this opening, I was completely hooked with Senua and her story. Throughout the game, we learn of her life up to this point. In chronological order, Senua is born to a devoutly religious and abusive father, Zinbel, and a priestess mother, Galena, who too suffers from psychosis. Her mother sees her condition as a gift, with which she can use to help her community as a healer, often foreseeing events and able to give advice that others are unable to see. Zinbel, however, sees his wife's condition as a curse and an affront to the gods, and so he sacrifices her by burning her to death on a pyre, as was the fashion at the time. After seeing this event, it traumatizes Senua, forcing her to repress the memory, believing instead that her mother killed herself in order to escape her psychosis. Growing up, Senua is physically and emotionally abused by Zinbel. She's imprisoned for long periods, forbidden to leave the house and socialise with the village, in order to save her father the embarrassment of being related to someone like Senua. One day she meets Dillian, who becomes her lover, and with his encouragement she undertakes the warrior trials. With the strength now to stand up against her father, she informs him that she is leaving home, and then threatens him with her sword when he tries to stop her. After an unknown amount of time, a plague sweeps through Senua and Dillian's village, killing many people including Dillian's father. Racked with guilt, thinking that she truly does carry a curse, and that she brought the plague to the village, Senua becomes a Gelt. In Pictish culture, this is a person who's driven to madness by grief, trauma, or some other illness, who leaves the village into the wilds in exile as punishment or in search of penance. Senua believes that by living this way she can cure her psychosis and keep her village safe from her supposed curse. It is during her time as a Gelt that she meets Druth, a scholar and former slave of the Northmen who mentors Senua, teaching her about Norse culture and religion. The pair form a bond until Druth's death, during which he vows to help Senua from the afterlife. Sometime later, Senua returns home to find that her village has been razed to the ground by the Northmen and her lover Dillian sacrificed in a gruesome display. With Dillian dead, with Druth dead, with Galena, her mother, dead, and her abusive father cast out of her life, Senua has nothing left. She suffers an intense psychotic breakdown. She now believes that she can enter the Norse underworld to save the soul of her lover by travelling north to Helheim and bargaining with Hela as Druth had taught her. And this is where we find Senua at the start of the game, at one of the lowest points of her life, broken and alone, guided and taunted by the voices in her head. It's one of the most realistic, relatable depictions of a protagonist's relationship with trauma that I've ever seen in a game. It's on par with Tiny Tina's character arc in the Borderlands 2 DLC Assault on Dragon's Keep. Seriously, go play that game. After defeating Valravn and Surt, Senua opens the way to Helheim. Hela herself smites Senua, breaking her sword and her spirit. This defeat forces Senua to contemplate ending everything. Scarring herself with her broken sword, she has visions of Dillian who encourages her to keep going. She undergoes the warrior trials of the body, mind and spirit and finally claims Gram, a sword powerful enough to take on Hela. Senua is then cast into the sea of corpses and tortured with their screams as the shadow follows her, claiming that these lost souls are here because of Senua's curse. She moves through a terrifying area now, chased by the darkness, a euphemism of her psychosis, which takes the shape of a garm. Senua drops Dillian's head into a chasm, and she must now descend and meet what has been chasing her. This garm is revealed to be Senua's unresolved trauma caused by her abusive father. Repairing the bridge to Helheim, Senua prepares to enter Hela's lair. Upon realizing that this course of action spells death for Senua, and hence also death for her Furies, they leave her, and Senua prepares to face Hela completely alone. Before she enters, however, Druth meets her and tells her one last story. This is a small cutscene that only plays if you have collected all the game's collectible lore stones. Druth implies that it was Zinbel, Senua's father, who led the Northmen to Dillian's village and caused his death, telling her that, in the end, it is not the gods who cause so much suffering, Senua, it is those close to us. There's a lot to unpack here, but we'll get to it later. Senua enters Hela's lair where she faces an endless wave of Northmen, and although she holds out bravely, she's finally defeated and learns that the whole adventure had been constructed in her mind. This was all a hallucination caused by her psychosis. She learns that it was impossible to rid herself of her psychosis, and she must instead accept and live with it. She learns that it was impossible to bring back Dillian, and she must accept his loss. But more importantly, she learns that none of the trauma caused to her village or the people she cares about was her fault, as she was led to believe by her father and her delusions. She says that although the voices in her head are not a lie, they are liars, meaning that although they do exist in her head, and maybe they always will, they do not always tell the truth, nor act in Senua's best interest. Again, there's a lot to unpack here. After learning Senua's story and playing through the game again, things start to make a bit more sense. This game is applauded for its sensitive and realistic depiction of living with psychosis, but it's more than that. It also shows us a sensitive and realistic depiction of how society views mental illness in general. Senua's father represents a side of society that wants to hide mental illness away as a taboo. Something to be scared of. Something to be ashamed of. Something to be wished away as if it were a phase or a passing fancy. After all, to admit that someone experiences a different reality from you can lead you to question your own reality, and by extension lead you to question your own actions over the course of your life. For some, that's a very uncomfortable and agonizing experience, and so it seems easier to push the source of that pain out of our lives, rather than examining our own values, beliefs and actions. Dillian and Senua's mother represent the part of society that empathizes with someone suffering from mental illness. They see a person first and a disability second. They are the people who understand the difficulties involved with mental illness. They understand that maybe it can't be cured through medicine or therapy, that this person might have to live with their condition the rest of their life, that this person will have to learn how to cope with their condition. They are the part of society that recognizes how difficult this process will be and offers a supportive, nurturing environment for the person affected to make sense of their life and improve themselves. I knew that this was a game about mental illness, but it's about so much more. It's a story about family, and how those who cause us the most harm are often the ones we are closest to. This is summed up best in Druth's line. In the end, it is not the gods who cause so much suffering, Senua, it is those close to us. Or perhaps even when the narrator says, people think of evil as an unnatural, invisible force and so invoke the gods for protection. But evil can come from the hand behind the gods, a familiar hand, cold and cruel. This is a game that is giving a commentary on how we treat people with mental illness. That we often treat them as taboo, broken or weak people. That sometimes we treat them as an object that will bring shame to us. That a mental illness must be hidden away, imprisoned in a basement. As if living with a condition like this wasn't hard enough already, people with a mental illness must bear a second burden given to them by society and those closest to them. They are given a stigma, they are given isolation, they are given mistreatment. Senua's illness causes her to create a fantasy world in her mind where she faces not just her own demons, but the manifestation of demons given to her by her father's abuse. Senua cannot get rid of her condition. She cannot get rid of the voices in her head, but she can get rid of the guilt and shame that her father tried to instill in her. She was not responsible for her mother's death. She was not responsible for her father's cruelty. She was not responsible for the plague released on her village. She was not responsible for Dillian's death. With Dillian and her mother's encouragement, Senua had started to see a baseline truth with which to start from. A stable foundation from which to stand and take on the day-to-day struggles that her condition brings. A stable land upon which she can stand up after being knocked down again and again. No matter how many times her furies lie to her, she has a stable rock upon which to balance herself and judge the truth. No longer is her father, the representation of society's judgment, able to kick out that rock from under her. What Senua needs are people she can trust, who can help guide her through her struggles into some kind of stable reality. A trusted voice telling her, "Get up, Senua. I'm here, and this is real. Block, parry, counter, watch out." That kind of trust is not easily earned, especially from someone who has suffered abuse like Senua. But for those of us who do not understand a condition like psychosis, sometimes it is all we can offer. We can only open our ears, listen, learn and hope to understand. We can treat each other as real human beings with a story, a struggle, with high points and low points. Senua's story feels incredibly real. The game's artwork, attention to history and lore, Senua's cocky swagger, her every successful parry, the brutality of her combat, the manifestations of her fears. Yet, it was all made up in her head during a psychotic episode. It left me wondering what has actually been real in my life. Which of my struggles were real? Were they really as hard as they seemed to be at the time? What things can be trusted? Upon which rock have I built my life around? Do I even have a stable ground underneath me upon which to stand? Which people are telling me the truth? Do I even tell myself the truth? The last question is easy to answer. It's a definitive no. I often do not tell myself the truth. I tell myself sometimes, I'll never make it, and that this is silly, and that I can't do it, that I'll never do it, that I should just give up, and what's the point of trying? And sometimes that things would be easier if I wasn't here. But I'm also lucky enough to have successes behind me to help guide me through my lowest points. All of those successes were based on simple plans that grew and became obsessions. Sometimes those obsessions would harm me, like when I gave myself tendinitis from practicing 70 hours a week after I became a professional musician. Medical professionals told me that I was always going to suffer from this unless I gained about 20 kilograms of muscle. That news shattered me. As a small, skinny, 52 kilogram, 22-year-old, that seemed like an insurmountable task. But I had followed a simple plan to become a professional musician, so I eventually realised that I was perfectly capable of making a new plan and following that. I listened to how other people had achieved the same goal. I learnt how to squat, how to deadlift and bench press. My 52 kilogram body weight became 60, became 70, became 80 kilograms, and before I knew it I had long surpassed my goal, and more than that, I had found a new hobby that I loved. Every day when I stepped into the squat rack, I took a weight on my shoulders that would try and pin me down, that would try and squash me, try and drive me deep into the earth. It was my job to accept this burden willingly, to squat down with it and stand back up again. With every rep, I learned what strength I had in me. I had many years of stepping into that squat rack and feeling the burden on my shoulders as I unracked the weight. Whether I felt good or bad that day, the weight had to be squatted no matter what. The bar never made itself lighter to boost my confidence. It never made itself heavier to humiliate me. It just sat in that squat rack, inert, unthinking, unmoving, like a silent sentinel, guarding the next part of my self-esteem. As Henry Rowland says, the iron never lies to you. It doesn't flatter you. It doesn't shame you. It has no ulterior motive. It has no vested interest. It is not corrupt. It just sits in the squat rack, unmoving, unflinching, unyielding, awakening a part of my soul. In a world that lies and manipulates us into buying the new thing, consuming the next thing, voting for the current thing, it's hard to know who to trust, but I knew I could trust that barbell. It was always going to tell me exactly what I was capable of. When I learned how to eat properly, I put more weight on the bar. When I learned how to sleep properly, I put more weight on the bar. When I learned how to ignore all the people who made fun of my new hobby, I put more weight on the bar. When I learned how to ignore the people who praised me and my new hobby, I put more weight on the bar. And now every time I face a problem, I picture that bar lying in my squat rack, like an old friend whispering to me, "Come on, you can do this. You've done it before, and you can do it again." We all need a reality that we can believe in, one that doesn't shock us too much or cause us to recoil in horror. For this reason, some people turn away from reality and invent their own. A reality in which everything is okay and nobody has any problems. Some people turn a blind eye when they see abuse and trauma in their friends and family. They think it's not as bad as it looks, or that person must be lying, or that they're exaggerating, or that they're maybe just weak for not being able to deal with their problems. Or worse, they might think that person deserves it, that they brought it on themselves, that it's punishment for living a wicked life. Every person you meet is fighting a battle that you know nothing about. Maybe they're under stress from working overtime that day, or maybe they've been completely knocked down and are incapable of standing back up again, incapable of even finding a solid place on which to stand. My family lie about my uncle. Sometimes it seems like he is a dirty secret on their family name. They tell people that he just had depression, that he smoked too much of that wacky-backy stuff. As much as they love him, they dare not mention psychosis or schizophrenia. Why they tried to paint this false picture, I don't know. Whether they can't bear to speak the truth, or whether they think he'll face scorn and ridicule from other people, I don't know. They try to lie to me about him. And when they do, I remind them of the truth, like my barbell reminds me of the truth. I remind them how awful a condition like schizophrenia is, how much he must be suffering, how much he fights every day, and I remind them that we all do the best we can with what we know. I know they are struggling to cope with the situation. I know they are doing the best they can. but still I get angry when I see them treat him this way. People often lie about others' accomplishments. They do so to diminish the other person and so make themselves appear better in comparison. I've told my dad all about how I first got into weight training to heal an injury. I've told him how it makes me feel to see progress in a hobby I love. I've told him about how I leave a weaker version of myself at the bottom of a squat and stand up a little stronger than before, and yet he still thinks I do it for vanity in order to get girls. It's heartbreaking to hear a close family member lie to you or put down your accomplishments like that when all you wanted to hear was, "Well done, son. I'm proud of you." Those closest to us can leave the deepest scars on our heart, scars that we keep secret. When those closest to us develop a mental illness like Senua, like my uncle, it's important that we understand them, look deep into their souls and find out exactly what trauma they are going through. It's important that we face the truth, no matter how painful it might be for us to hear. It never seems like it at the time, and it often doesn't for a long time afterwards, but there is a small amount of beauty in suffering. If nothing else, it's something real to point to, a reality to hold on to, a stable place upon which we can stand, get back up and start again. Get up. You can do this. I believe in you. I was 11 when my uncle was first admitted to a psychiatric hospital. His name is Alec and he's the reason that I'm here today. He's not my secret. I am proud of him. I am proud to tell you his story. Living with a condition like that, he is one of the bravest people I have ever met. He died alone 10 years ago of heart failure in a completely barren apartment that contained only 3 pieces of furniture. He was 54. I'm sorry. I wish I had done more. I miss you, Uncle Alec.